All right, hello everyone, and welcome to my channel. This channel is for educational purposes, and we check out some great theories of everything, all-encompassing theories, grand unified theories, and other earth-shattering discoveries, paradigm shifters, things that are explosive. They are very impactful, and they could change your life, but you've never heard of them because they've been suppressed from everyday discourse. And it's kind of the things that you can't really say. They're taboo in polite society. And one of those fits into the Bible decodes that we're doing. This is, I believe, number 247. And we're sticking with the New Testament, and we're looking at the many different authors and commentators who have discussed the Roman origins hypothesis for the New Testament. That is, that the New Testament was not written by Jesus-following, Aramaic-speaking, illiterate followers of Jesus in Judea, but by the fully funded and bilingual, literate Caesars of the Roman Empire, the Flavian dynasty of Caesars. That is Emperor Vespasian and his two sons, Emperors Titus and Domitian, who ruled the Roman Empire from 69 until 96 AD. And they wrote the story of the Gospels and backdated the story by 40 plus years to set it in the early 30s. Then at the very same time, they wrote a history of a war between the Romans and the Jews from 66 to 73 AD. Both Emperor Vespasian and Emperor Titus were generals in that war. They were both wounded in that war. And they both had observed how big of a pain in the butt it was to deal with the Jews. For over 130 years, the Romans had had conflicts with the Jews because they were colonizing the Jews, and the Jews were thought they were the chosen people. And they were, xenophobic, and they did not want to obey the Romans. They wanted to obey God, and God had given them a bunch of rituals and strictures and limitations, things that they needed to perform in their daily life. And many of these things kind of clashed with what the Romans wanted. And so it was one revolution after a uprising, after a riot, after a terrorist attack, after an assassination, after a war. And this culminated in the War of 66, starting in 66 AD, when at least three kind of self-proclaimed messiahs rose up and actually threw out the puppet king, hired by the Romans, the Herod Agrippa II, kicked him out of kicked him out of Jerusalem, and sent him back to Rome, where he told Nero about it, and Nero sent in General Vespasian to put down the revolt. But it took 7 years. They completely destroyed the Jews, but they knew how resilient the Jews were. And so they immediately went to one of the Romans' go-to moves, which is a psychological operation. They knew the Jews were waiting for military messiahs to help them overthrow the Romans. And so instead they wrote a story about a Jewish messiah who was a prince of peace and believed in rendering unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and walking the extra mile with a Roman soldier's heavy pack, turning the other cheek to oppression, and so on and so on. Throughout the Gospels, Jesus is nothing but deferential to the Romans. The only time that Jesus gets riled up is when he's around the Jews, where he's overturning the tables of the Jewish money changers at the temple, who are trying to switch out the dirty Roman money for the kosher Jewish money to be used in the temple for buying small animals for the sacrifice. And he goes after the vendors who are selling the animals as well. So this is exactly what Jesus would be if he were written by the Romans. The Romans wanted to mellow out the Jews, to tame, in their language, tame the Jews, or domesticate the Jews, or prune the Jews. And they also wanted to, Titus in particular, wanted to graft the Caesars onto the lineage of the Jews. So what they did is they wrote this Gospels, and at the same time they wrote a history of the war between the Romans and the Jews called Jewish War. And that came out under the pseudonym of Josephus, or Josephus. And it's in 7 volumes. And if you read Josephus and you read the Gospels pretty much like at the same time, you can see so many different similarities, parallels, parodies, parables between the two. A lot of codes, a lot of, hidden language and coincidences. Themes and motifs that run parallel to each other. And you can see the grafting, where the prophecies that Jesus makes in the New Testament are fulfilled in the pages of War of the Jews. And most of them are fulfilled by Titus, including the prophecy that Jesus makes about the city of Jerusalem being destroyed, torn up, not one stone left upon the other. And that is fulfilled by Titus. And Jesus says that that destruction of the temple is the marking of his second coming. So that makes Titus the second coming of Jesus. He is grafting himself onto the lineage of the Jewish, going all the way back to Adam and Seth, Enoch and Noah, Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, and Moses and David and Solomon and Jesus, and then Titus. And a lot of it is like that. A lot of the parallels. Whoever wrote Josephus also wrote the Gospels. They work together, and they present a code, and they present a lot of mocking and ridicule of the Jews and anybody else who believes this fiction that they're telling about this Jesus Messiah character that is mysteriously pro-Roman and anti-Jewish. And then they move on to the next part of the Bible, where all the Pauline epistles are, and Paul is even more pro-Roman than Jesus was, and even more anti-Jew than Jesus was. Now that's just kind of that's evidence from the text. But when you look at the parallels that are involved, Michael Menescot's dug into the book of Luke looking for parallels with the War of the Jews. He found over 250 of them just in the book of Luke. And then when he graphed all of them onto a chart, using the book of Luke on the vertical axis and War of the Jews on the horizontal axis, he produced 5 almost perfect letters in Latin, the language of the Roman Caesars. The Caesars literally signed their names to the book of Luke. APTVS, Titus Vespasian. And then who else? Who knows who else? Also, Joseph Atwill, in his book Caesar's Messiah, noted that Jesus's ministry in Judea is nothing but a replica of Titus's military campaign in Judea. Every place that Titus goes, Jesus also goes. And they go to these places in the same order, and at every location encounter parallel events that are spaced out by exactly 40 years. And we're talking about over 40 events. Also, the Gospels and Josephus are both written in Greek, which is the other language of the Roman Caesars, who mainly spoke both Greek and Latin and wrote in both, while not so much in Judea. And the Romans also had a monopoly on publishing, censorship, and distribution, such that nobody is writing anything in the first century Roman Empire without the approval of Caesar. Now, we're looking at a book here that's called Operation Messiah by Rosemary Sheldon and Thies Voskuilen. And they explore Paul here. It's a limited version of the Roman origins hypothesis. They can see how almost comically, ridiculously pro-Roman Paul is, but don't really apply those same standards to Jesus. And admittedly, Jesus is not quite as pronounced as Paul. And so they kind of make a distinction, and as a result, they kind of form a limited conclusion that Paul is an intelligence agent of the Romans. So they got the psychological operation part right, but they don't have the scope of it right. It's not just Paul, it's the entire book is the psychological operation, not just Paul never existed, Jesus never existed. This is all fiction, and it's a psyop from top to bottom. But instead, here they say that, well, yeah, Paul existed and Jesus existed, and the what's written in the Bible is some type of history. But Paul is a fake. He's a fraud. He, on his road to Damascus, when he has his conversion, that's all fake, so that he can infiltrate the Nazarene movement of James, the brother of Jesus, and Peter, kind of the Jewish Christians. So we are, I believe, in chapter 10 of this book, and we're going through some passages talking about both Jesus and Paul and kind of the motives involved here, I believe. The beliefs of the Nazarenes throw valuable light on the views of Jesus himself. If James, Jesus' own brother, and the apostles who lived and worked with Jesus did not believe in the doctrines of later Christianity, the abrogation of the Torah, and the deification of Jesus, the central rites of the Eucharist and baptism in the Christian sense, then the natural inference is that Jesus himself did not preach them either. We cannot therefore regard Jesus as the founder of Christianity and must look elsewhere for someone to fill this role. Jesus did not leave any writings behind that could point to him having started a new religious doctrine, nor did he erect any churches for a new organized religion. Some explain the discrepancies by saying that Jesus's closest associates simply never understood him. Here is where we must ask a crucial question. Which is more likely, that Jesus' closest disciples failed to understand his most important message, or that Pauline Christians, writing Gospels at least 50 years after Jesus' death, and faced with the unpalatable fact that the Nazarenes disagreed with Paul's doctrines, had to insert into their Gospels denigratory material about the apostles in order to counteract the influence of the Nazarenes. It's an interesting theory, but it's convoluted. Occam's razor again, how about we just say that the Romans wrote the whole thing? That's the one that answers the most questions. Explains, with the most explanatory power. The question then becomes, was Paul the founder of Christianity, or did later Christians put these ideas into Acts and perhaps even into the so-called Pauline epistles? Later Christians faced the dilemma that they were putting forward a view of Jesus that was denied by the most authoritative people of all, the apostles in Jerusalem, the companions of Jesus. Their only choice was to glorify Paul, even though this contemporary of the early Jesus followers had little credibility with the apostles at the time. In Acts, we are given the picture of a Jerusalem church at one extreme and Paul at another, with Peter uneasily shifting between the two. Now, this maybe did and should point out the parallels between this whole thing and the Dead Sea Scrolls, where you've got Jesus in this case, Jesus as the what's he called? The teacher of righteousness, and Paul as the liar, or there's another term for him, the wicked priest. Well, there's the wicked priest, and then there's the liar. And so Paul would be one of those, and then maybe Peter would be one of them. I think Barbara Thiering and others would actually place John the Baptist as the teacher of righteousness and Jesus as the liar. And I think Paul is the wicked priest. So it's they're just kind of bringing up this this triumvirate and trying to fit that in here. The entire Jerusalem church is guided by Peter, himself guided by God, moving in the direction of the Pauline standpoint. The entire aim of the book of Acts is to portray the essential unity of the early church and hide the fact that there was a deep conflict between Paul and the Nazarenes under the leadership of James and Peter. The Pauline church was not willing to base its rejection of the Torah on Paul alone, because it would mean that it had abandoned the authority associated with the Nazarenes. This would have left a suspicious and obvious gap between Jesus and Paul. It would have been clear that the abrogation of the Torah was Paul's idea alone, not based on any tradition derived from the historical Jesus. The story Acts tells is that James and Peter were so obtuse that they had to be brought to the realization that Jesus, during his lifetime, was telling them something they quite failed to comprehend at the time. Why did Paul even introduce the question of whether it was possible for a Gentile to share in devotion to the awaited resurrected Messiah without becoming a full Jew? Why did he not just proselytize among the Jews and have the Nazarenes on his side? Because other Messiah figures who had no appeal beyond the Jewish confines had seen their movements fizzle out. They failed politically because the Romans usually destroyed them. Paul's ambition was too large to be confined to such a narrow movement. Once a Messiah figure had been crushed by the Romans, the hopes of his followers died with him. Paul needed to invent a Messiah who was palatable to the Romans. Seems like they're kind of putting the cart before the horse here. More like the Romans were creating a Messiah and Paul to be palatable to, the Jews. Paul's movement was unique because of its doctrine of resurrection, by which all its hopes were kept alive even after the crucifixion of Jesus. The Nazarene movement, although it continued to exist, remained dangerous because of its claim of a messiahship linked to the kingship of the Jews. The Nazarenes believed that when Jesus returned to the earth as king of the Jews, then the nation he commanded would consist of only Jews. No Gentiles would belong to this nation or be subject to him. Even those Gentiles who had become God-fearers would not belong to the nation of the Messiah. They would continue to belong to their own nations, revering the Messiah from a distance. Paul's movement would recruit everyone. Paul said he was convinced that the Torah had been abolished by the divine Jesus, and therefore nothing in it about the Messiah was valid. Only Paul's new version of the story would survive. The distinction between Jews and Gentiles had been abolished, and the only notion left of the Messiah was the disembodied myth of a Jesus with no political aspirations. But if you read just the Gospels, you still get a Jesus with no political aspirations. So render unto Caesar what is Caesar's are not exactly political aspirations. And so, again, they seem to have a blind spot there about that. The Nazarene movement had problems with the temple authorities, not because they were a new religion, which they were not, but because theirs was a monarchical, messianic political movement within Judaism. Its aims may have been religious, but its religious aims were couched in political terms. And in the same way, Jesus' teachings were interpreted as political by the Roman establishment. The Nazarene movement would have been interpreted as dangerous because it made the religious future of the Jews and of the world dependent upon liberation from the Roman Empire. Pauline Christianity, as expressed in the New Testament, in depoliticizing Jesus, there isn't any depoliticizing to do, but we'll just pretend that there is. Pauline Christianity, as expressed in the New Testament in depoliticizing Jesus, also created and depoliticized the picture of a Jerusalem church. The Paulinists represented it as an otherworldly religious sect, looking forward to a savior of souls, not of bodies or of politics. Later Christian writers turned the various political persecutions suffered by the Nazarenes into religious martyrdoms. Thus the killing of James, the son of Zebedee, by King Herod Agrippa, and the killing of his namesake James, the brother of Jesus, by the high priest Ananus in 62 AD, are represented as martyrdoms for the transcendent Pauline Christ. Now, this killing of James, brother of Jesus, is only recounted in Roman sources like Josephus. It's in Josephus, and it might also be in Tacitus. Both of them are obviously members of the Roman royal families. Flavius Josephus, whoever he was, or whether it was even one person or a whole team of writers. So, again, they, the writings of Josephus can't be taken seriously as history, which is a huge problem because so many ancient historians rely upon Josephus because he's really the only source for a lot of the history of the first century Roman Empire. In fact, they were casualties of the resistance against Roman occupation and its Sadducee minions, just as Jesus himself was falsely represented as a victim of Judaism through the depoliticization of his life's work. So the tragedies among his followers in the Nazarene movement were removed from the account of Roman oppression and laid at the door of Judaism. Well, if that's what they mean by depoliticization, if they're just depoliticizing Roman oppression, but they say depoliticization of Jesus and his life's work. His life's work had nothing to do with politics at all. Even in the fictional story about him, the Gospels. The myth of Jewish persecution of the Nazarenes was created out of a movement that was not at odds with other Jews at all, but was loyal to both the Torah and to Israel. The earliest Christian evidence, Paul's letters, paint a picture of a Mediterranean-wide mission carried out without the slightest hint of constraint by Rome, or for that matter, from Jerusalem's priestly hierarchy. Nobody in power seems much worried about the story Paul is spreading. Such an interpretation discounts the available data for the opposition of the Nazarene establishment to Paul's mission. But that's key. Nobody in power seems much worried about the story Paul is spreading. And nobody in power seems much worried about the story of the Gospels either. And he calls it the myth of persecution, of Jewish persecution of the Nazarenes. But then there's also the myth of the Roman persecution of the Christians. The Romans were persecuting the Nazarenes. But the Nazarenes were Jewish Christians, not Pauline Christians. They still believed in the Jewish traditions, the Ten Commandments, the Sabbath, the circumcision, and the kosher food laws and dietary constraints and the strictures on graven images, all of these things, the animal sacrifice, all of these things Paul wanted to get rid of. And Jesus is somewhat keen on getting rid of them as well. Okay, this section is called The Message and Rome. We cannot say Paul changed the entire Roman Empire, but his activities certainly paved the way for and gave the theoretical framework for a movement that would radically change the Roman world and ours. By the 4th century, the church, recognized and patronized by the Roman emperor, was an international Gentile community, hostile to diversity both within and without. Even Christians outside the officially sanctioned church were persecuted as heretics. Pagan non-participants increasingly became the object of legal harassment. Jews, though permitted their peculiar worship, were universally condemned as enemies of the prophets and as the murderers of Christ. Paul's goal had been accomplished: the marriage of the Roman Empire with a faith that provided a driving ideology, one that would survive the empire itself. Almost like the Romans, just used a sleight of hand and shifted their power from the Roman Empire to the Roman Catholic Church. And it's all the same people. The Flavians, the first pope, the second pope was Clement. He's a Flavian. A lot of the early Christian catacombs in Rome were built by the Flavians, and many of the early Christian martyrs were Flavians because of Emperor Domitian. He had pretty much a feud with his older brother Titus, and so he put to death some of Titus's followers who were in his family. That's not persecution of Christians. That's persecution of your own family members. Anyway, that's the end of the chapter, and we'll get back start with chapter 11 tomorrow, which is something to look forward to. So I hope to see you back there tomorrow. Thanks for tuning in today, and have a great night.